also say that the way of seeing the letters of the Torah as both a creation and a medium can also be said regarding the Torah Sheba'al Peh and wisdom that's come through the Chachamim, the scholars of the generations. And it can also be said that what you said about the need for sophistication regarding the written Torah can also be stated regarding the oral law, that there's a need to have a sophisticated approach towards that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the point of Pi Haaretz, the mouth of the earth, part of the reason it's so important in a way that the sages are underlining for us is that at the end of the day, if we're looking at this moment, Korach rebelling against Moshe, what is that about? That's about the question of what the Torah means, right? That there's a political revolution that's brewing under Moshe because there's an argument about what we're supposed to be doing. At the end of the day, it's up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make the judgment of who's right. Like, we make our arguments and we decide, who's convincing. But like we said before, yes, Kadosh Baruch Hu is the author of the Torah. He's the author of Torah Sheba'al Peh. He's also the author of War and Peace. He's also the author of the Zohar and other Kabbalistic works. But the point is, he's the author of everything, including a whole lot of falsehood that is part of the reality that he's created. And he doesn't want us to take every piece of reality and see it as a message that we can use to decide how to act. And so what has to happen is people have to make their play of, all right, let me state my methods. How do I know what Hashem wants of me? This person over here will say, I'm going to find out what Hashem wants of me by reading the Torah, by reading Nevi'im, by reading Tuvim, by reading the Mishnah, by reading the Gemara. That's, and obviously, other sources, commentators, whatever, latter poskim, etc., who help us to make sense of those sources. But the standard package of rabbinic Judaism, or whatever you want to call it, had those fundamental sources as the ones where you start from there and you don't try to expunge or edit those parts, but you try to grapple with them and then you work out the rest. There are others who have attempted other methods, right? There are people who have said, we need less than that. We don't need Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? The Tzdukim are no longer around. And it's seemingly because Pi Haaretz swallowed them up, so to speak. We also have people who may be trying to add some things, which is, by the way, asur according to the Torah, like lo tosifu, you're not supposed to add to the Torah. But there are people in the present day where the way they act, it's as though they're learning new or other Torah from latter Kabbalistic works, essentially, and then it becomes part of their practice, and it supersedes things that are really coming from Torah Shebichtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. And so those become divergent methodologies for how do we find out what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do. And to some degree, the test of time shows if HaKadosh Baruch Hu approves of one or the other. And it may not be that all of those issues are fully empirically resolved yet. But we have to state our method and make our gamble, so to speak. And we find out iteratively how right we are, and maybe we can get the message from the world around us and change if we're wrong. So maybe we can realize, we need to be more open to something, or maybe we can realize we need to be less open to something, because Hashem is helping us to figure out that we're on the right track or not. But the sources we're working from are something that we can be reflective about and be open about, and then make the case on that basis. And ultimately, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, as was the case in the past, if there are different games in town right now for how to argue for that methodology, some of those may not lead down a path that lasts all the way to the end of the line.
You could look at the conservative movement in America and how so many conservative temples have now become Korean churches, and see how what was once a very dominant movement in America is now basically in a rapid decline.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sad, but I think that is a recent and striking demonstration of the phenomenon that we're talking about, where I think you could, being generous, say that, especially at the beginning of that movement, there were those involved in leading it, where you could say they had the sincere desire of some kind to argue for this new methodology as a proper methodology for serving Hashem. And it's proven to be a movement that largely can't perpetuate itself, and also that can't even hold the line in maintaining itself in one place with constant standards about a variety of things. So the sort of sinkhole phenomenon of Korach is, and this is true of many things in the Torah, you have creation in 7 days, and then you have these kind of Shabbatot of 7 years, or 7 times 7 years. There's all these different time scales on which the world works in actuality, and the Torah tells us that. So it's not always that the sinkhole just opens its mouth and Korach and his followers go down the minute after Moshe stops speaking, but it might be that a century later, on that time scale, in the blink of an eye, the same kind of thing happens. And it doesn't have to mean that also that people are underground in a geologic sense, but it can still be the case that their connection to Torah amounts to as much.
It is interesting how you had that prototype of Korach, which served as an example of that which we would see over and over again, this type of theological challenges that continued throughout Jewish history.
Yeah, and I guess since it's Lag BaOmer, I can't help but thinking about whether the model from Korach is meant to cover everything, or whether there are different models that the Torah gives us. Because we also have Nadav and Avihu, for example. Like, what's the difference between Korach and his followers on the one hand, and Nadav and Avihu on the other? Korach is more objecting to the structure of castes or priestly designations or what have you that exist within the system that Moshe is telling the people, this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, and calling for maybe more kind of egalitarianism, and therefore also kind of elimination of the Kiddusha, the separateness of the Kohanim, and implicitly, therefore, maybe also the separateness of Am Yisrael and their Kiddusha relative to the nations. Now, there's this midrash about how Korach is arguing with Moshe about whether or not a garment that's made entirely of tchelet needs to have tzitzit or not. And so there's this issue of the one blue thread as like a separate color that's different from all the rest. And that's the thing that he's kind of trying to argue against by saying, no, it's all tchelet, we're all kadosh, and kulam kedushim. And that's different than the Nadav and Avihu. And the Nadav and Avihu is, I think, when I think about the bonfires in Har Meron and all of the halfway there to Avodah Zarah, or maybe more severely almost there to Avodah Zarah, or already there, and that whole spectrum of practices that we now have going on in Lag BaOmer, where we're lighting sacred fires at graves of people whose ghosts are expected to give us blessings, and how much that just sounds like totally forbidden idolatrous practice according to the Torah. That sounds much more to me like Nadav and Avihu, where they're bringing in Esh Zara. They're like lighting a fire that was not commanded by Hashem. And that also carries with it, ultimately a similar kind of result. But I think there's a difference in the sense that if I'm comparing those events, in the case of Nadav and Avihu, there was kind of a misplaced sincerity and their desire to somehow draw near to Hashem, and they just were getting it wrong by allowing themselves to make up new means of doing that, and that's highly problematic. And in that instance, no one had to stand up and make some kind of declaration saying, like, let HaKadosh Baruch Hu judge between you and me. There was not some event where someone first indicted them and then argued that Nadav and Avihu had done something wrong. It just happened, right? The fire consumed them. So there was something that it wasn't based on some kind of disputation over how things should be done correctly or not, at least in the actual verses that we have in Parshat Shmini. And then you go over to Korach, and there's much more this sense of like, first we're going to have a big conversation about this, and we're going to argue about what's right, and then call upon HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bear witness, and we'll see who is right, because Hashem will show us. And so that's a significant difference. And I'm thinking about this on the fly, so I'm not sure whether you could say both of those models apply if we're talking about Lag BaOmer and the troubling amount of near Avodah Zarah or Avodah Zarah that happens on Lag BaOmer because of the worship of Rishbi and all of that. Maybe both of those models apply each in their way, and you'd have to kind of think carefully about how they line up. Or maybe on the other hand, you could say, no, this is an Esh Zara, Nadav and Avihu kind of situation, hands off, let HaKadosh Baruch Hu deal with it, versus some other kinds of arguments between different sectors of Am Yisrael that maybe are more or less comfortable with the kehuna of the Kohanim or with the kehuna of Am Yisrael relative to the nations, where there has to be kind of a public debate at some level and some kind of a demonstration before the eyes of everyone that someone understands what's going to happen when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is demonstrating how he feels about the matter.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.